Cincinnati. It's nice to see so many smiling faces. The Junior League of Cincinnati, we're a 92-year-old volunteer organization whose mission is to train women to affect community change. And to affect change, it's obviously critical that we understand the issues that are impacting our community. To that end, each October, our Public Affairs Committee hosts a meeting, sometimes we've hosted them here before, about a particular issue, a levy, or even a political race to educate our members and the public so that we can make informed decisions at the voting polls. We are so happy to be here tonight in collaboration with the Cincinnati Museum Center and the League of Women Voters to share information about Issue 2. Our collaboration with these two great organizations does go back some years, and both have been very generous partners with us. And I have to share with you a little secret that maybe everybody doesn't know about, but we also have another tie to the Cincinnati Museum Center, and that is with the Children's Museum. Over 20 years ago, the startup of the Children's Museum was a project of the Junior League of Cincinnati. And through the efforts of our membership, we had more than 300 women work to engage the community and raise funds, all in the name of building a world-class children's museum. We staffed a traveling exhibit that traveled throughout the city, and we actually held the first fundraising event for the Children's Museum, where we had over 1,000 people in attendance. The museum now boasts an attendance of more than 1 million visitors annually, which is incredible, and it is also ranked one of the top 10 children's museums in the nation every year. It is now my pleasure to introduce Lee Hoffheimer, the Vice President of Institutional Advancement for the Cincinnati Museum Center. Lee's team is responsible for managing all of the fundraising activities for the museum, including operational, endowment, and capital fundraising initiatives. In addition, she's responsible for managing the more than 800 volunteers that it takes to run the Cincinnati Museum. Please join me in welcoming Lee Hoffheimer, sustaining member of the Junior League of Cincinnati, of course, give you a little plug, and the Vice President of Institutional Advancement.
Thanks, Melanie. On behalf of the Board of Trustees and Doug McDonald, who can't be here tonight, our President and CEO, welcome to Cincinnati Museum Center at Union Terminal. In addition to our valued partnership with the Junior League, we have also partnered with the League of Women Voters, as well as WCPO to host various political debates. As a Center for Community Dialogue, tonight's discussion on Ohio Issue 2 should provide the audience here, as well as those participating online through WCPO's website, a well-rounded look at the ballot issue regarding Senate Bill 5. And we are in good hands for this discussion. Marianne Zalesnik is the moderator for tonight's issue forum. Marianne is a distinguished journalist and has received many awards over the years for her service to our community. So we thank you for joining us. Not only can you hear Marianne on WBXU almost every day, she also serves as news director for the station. So without further ado, we all welcome you, and please joining me in welcoming tonight's moderator, Marianne Zalesnik.
Thanks, Lee. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and I always look forward to moderating these types of debates, because even though, as the person asking the questions, I sure get to learn a lot, and I know that's why you're all here as well this evening. Just a couple of ground rules before we get started. We do love applause, and it's a great thing, and when our panelists come up, you can cheer and do anything you'd like, but as we get going and start asking questions, we'd ask you to hold your applause. Often the answers, they have time limits as to how long they can speak, and the answers will get lost in the applause if you're clapping or jeering or anything like that. So we're going to keep that all quiet, and I'll remind you if there's a problem. But if you can, please remember to no applause at the beginning, applause at the end, and then the rest of the time just enjoy the discussion. First, a little bit of background. The Ohio Senate began discussing this collective bargaining bill early this year. And after weeks of talks and protests by thousands of police officers, firefighters, and teachers at the Capitol, the Senate passed the bill and sent it to the Ohio House, which also approved it. In late March, Governor John Kasich signed the bill into law. After the bill became law, groups opposed to it mobilized and got enough signatures on a petition to put the measure on this November's ballot. Now it's up to voters to decide if the law will stay in place. Voting yes on issue 2 keeps the law. Voting no will repeal it. We have 2 men joining us this evening to talk about the pros and cons of issue 2. In favor of the collective bargaining reforms is Gary Greenberg. He's a Cincinnati native, a graduate of Walnut Hills High School and the University of Michigan Law School. Mr. Greenberg is a shareholder in the law firm Denlinger, Rosenthal, and Greenberg. Since early 2011, Mr. Greenberg has advised and worked with the Cincinnati Tea Party and the Ohio Liberty Council on government employee collective bargaining reform in Ohio. Please welcome Gary Greenberg. Opposed to the collective bargaining reforms is David Pepper. He's also a Cincinnati native. Mr. Pepper served on Cincinnati City Council from 2001 to 2005 and the Hamilton County Commission from 2006 to 2010, serving as its president from 2009 to 2010. He's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Yale and a graduate of Yale Law School. Please welcome Mr. David Pepper. I'm going to go over just some brief rules tonight so you know how we're handling things. We're going to begin with 2-minute opening statements. There was a very official coin toss backstage, and Mr. Greenberg won. He elected to go first. He'll be followed by Mr. Pepper. We'll then begin the question segment of the forum. The Ohio League of Women Voters composed the questions, and the League of Women Voters of Cincinnati reviewed and edited them. However, they do not represent any official position of the League. Our panelists will receive 2 minutes to answer the question. The first respondent will also get 30 seconds for a rebuttal. We will alternate who answers the questions first. If there is time, I will ask 1 or 2 follow-up questions. Then each panelist will get 3 minutes to make a closing statement. This will be in the reverse order of the opening statements, so Mr. Pepper will go first, followed by Mr. Greenberg. Volunteers from the League of Women Voters here in the front row will be keeping the time, so I can alert the speaker when the time is up, and we will stop speakers who are going over the time limit. Tonight's forum is being streamed live on WCPO's website. So a round of applause for everyone here. Get that all out of our systems. And we'll begin with a 2-minute opening statement from Mr. Greenberg.
No, I'll take the 3. Well, thank you. Thank you all for being here tonight. What is democracy? According to Webster's dictionary, it's a government in which the supreme power is rested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation involving periodically held free elections. Supreme power to do what? In a true democracy, in my view, that should include our elected representatives having power to decide on behalf of the people how their tax money will be spent and how their public services will be delivered. Unfortunately, in Ohio, that's not what we have. In Ohio, since 1983, our state and local elected representatives do not have final authority to decide how our tax money will be spent or our public services delivered. For unionized police, fire, corrections officers, and state troopers, those decisions are made ultimately by unelected and unaccountable arbitrators with no recourse for citizens and taxpayers, no matter how damaging those decisions. For unionized teachers, sanitation workers, social service workers, and most other public employees in Ohio, these decisions might appear to be made by our elected representatives, but in fact they are coerced by the threat of legally sanctioned work stoppages that would disrupt essential public services. The result of this grant of excessive union power is what you would expect: higher and higher costs for the same or less public service, enormous budget-destroying cost increases for the same or less service. The purpose and effect of SB 5, now issue 2, is straightforward. It restores democracy, self-government, and fiscal accountability. I ask this audience to vote yes on issue 2 for democracy and for fiscal accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Greenberg. Mr. Pepper.
Thank you, and thanks to the Junior League and League of Women Voters for this debate, and Gary for agreeing to debate this issue. Let me just read a few quotes that have been said about Senate Bill 5. Senate Bill 5 sets up a rigged system. I have never seen such injustice in my life. Senate Bill 5 is ill-conceived and was honestly forced on us. Senate Bill 5 is a flawed and defective political statement. Another person said there were alternative ways to do this. What do the people I just all quoted have in common? They're all Republicans. Some of them voted for Senate Bill 5 and then later regretted how it went through. Some of them voted against it. Now, why would folks who agree with some of what's in this bill all be so clearly against it? It's because when you strip away a lot of the misleading facts, a lot of the TV ads, a lot of the other things you're seeing, this comes down to a very simple truth. Senate Bill 5 unfairly strips the basic rights of collective bargaining away from public servants. No longer can this critical part of Ohio's middle class have any meaningful negotiation or bargaining over their or their family's economic well-being. But even beyond their own direct economic interests, incredibly, Senate Bill 5 goes further. It muzzles our public servants on issues that directly impact all of us. Believe it or not, under Senate Bill 5, it's illegal for firefighters to have a meaningful negotiation about conditions affecting their work safety and your safety, such as the number of firefighters it takes to put out a fire and ride that fire truck to your rescue. It's illegal for teachers to bring up the fact that 40 students per class may be a little too much. Or nurses are under this law, not allowed under the law to actually negotiate and push for greater staff support, which is the key to your safety when you're in that hospital. I think all of us want these public servants who are on the front lines able to bring up these important issues. Under Senate Bill 5, that's just not allowed. It's illegal under this law. So their economic rights are stripped away, and their voice on critical issues for us is muzzled. As P.G. Sittenfeld, a candidate, said for city council, if Bill Cunningham and Bill Seitz are opposed to this law, it may be going just a little too far. Thank you.
Mr. Pepper. The first question this evening will go to Mr. Pepper. In your opinion, will public employees such as teachers, safety, and fire workers be able to bargain effectively for any of their conditions of employment if SB 5 becomes the law? And if not, does this concern you?
It's a great question. Absolutely not. One of the real misleading parts of this campaign is the other side says they still have collective bargaining. Let me explain to you the collective bargaining under Senate Bill 5. Currently, if as a county commissioner, if I negotiate with my union, which I've done many times, I bring a proposal forward, they bring a proposal forward, and if we don't agree, we do go to fact-finding. It gives a lot of incentive to bring forward a reasonable proposal. And then they help us ultimately determine if we can agree what the more fair proposals were. Under the new law, and this is the key to the whole thing, so I'm glad this was the first question. If I bring a proposal forward as management, and the employees bring a proposal forward, under the new collective bargaining reform, if we can't agree, guess who gets to decide the better proposal? Me. The bosses do. Can you believe that? As Bill Seitz analogized, imagine if there was a new divorce negotiation scheme. And women or wives were able to bring forward their proposal, and the husband brings forward his proposal. If they don't agree by the same rules here, under that situation, the husband, in consultation with his parents, would get to decide the proposal that they thought was most reasonable. That's the system under Senate Bill 5. Think about it for a second. Since the boss ultimately decides if there's not agreement, there's no negotiation. And there's every incentive in the world, if you're the boss, to throw out the most unreasonable proposal to start, not come to agreement, and then at the end of an impasse, which is going to happen, which you want to happen, you simply say, we're going to go with my proposal. And that's it. And then you're stuck for 3 years. So every single item up for discussion, bulletproof vests, wages, you name it, are all subject to this process, which even Bill Cunningham, again, called a charade. There isn't collective bargaining. As one Republican state senator from Northern Ohio said, what we have under this law is collective begging. It simply makes no sense.
Thank you, Mr. Pepper. Mr. Greenberg.
Let me start by getting the elephant out of the room. The pun was intended. Why have some Republicans come out so strongly against SB 5? Well, here's a little lesson on politics. You may know that in most cases, unions strongly support Democratic candidates. But there is one group of unions that typically over the years has supported Republicans over and over, and that's the Fraternal Order of Police and sometimes the Firefighters Union. So when you hear that some Republicans have come out against SB 5, against Issue 2, ask yourself this: is it because of principle or is it because of politics? I'm not here as a Republican. I'm here as a citizen and a taxpayer to say to you that when Mr. Pepper speaks of the boss making the final decision, he's talking about you. He's talking about the citizens and the taxpayers and your elected representatives. Okay, and I see I have to stop. I'm sure we'll come back to this.
I think you get more. I think you get 2 minutes.
How much time?
Yeah, that was
Yes.
2. That was just 1.
Oh,
I'm sorry, you get another minute.
thank you. Well,
That'll be Mr.
although
Pepper.
Mr. Pepper is incorrect, he is a gentleman.
Is it, what is it, 2, 1?
2, 2, and 30.
Right, no, you're right.
Okay.
You can
No, no.
Let's,
Go
all
on.
right, let's make sure it's correct. Let's start the clock again and give Mr. Greenberg 1 more minute, and then Mr. Pepper will have 30 seconds of rebuttal.
Perfect.
I'm sorry, Mr. Greenberg, please continue.
Gosh, my train of thought. That also is a pun. So anyway, I wanted to comment a little bit there on politics, but again, I wanted to return to the use of the word boss to describe who's making the decision on the other side of the table. This isn't like a private business. And my firm represents both private businesses and the public sector and government agencies and labor relations. When we have a private business negotiating with a union, we're wrestling over a share of the profits. That's one thing. But when we're talking about government agencies negotiating with their unions, we are talking about representing the citizens and the taxpayers. They're not bosses, they're you and me, trying to decide how to best allocate taxpayer resources, and it should be our elected representatives who make that final decision. That's democracy.
Mr. Pepper, 30 seconds.
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I think it's clear that they are the managers of the organization. But the other thing that I keep hearing, well, the elected officials are the ones making this decision. Probably the majority of the employees in this state under Senate Bill 5 will have this decision made by an unelected person. University boards, hospital boards, none of those folks are elected. And they will have the final say on these decisions. So the conflict of interest is clear. You can't be a judge and advocate in your own case. That's what this law sets up, and that's the reason why people, and by the way, Bill Seitz is not beholden to any union. He just fundamentally disagrees with the aspect I just described.
Very good. Question number 2. We'll start here with Mr. Greenberg. The Act expands the definition of management-level employee to include any faculty who individually or through a faculty senate or like organization participate in the governance of the institution, are involved in personnel decisions, selection or review of administrators, planning and use of physical resources, budget preparation, and determination of educational policies related to admissions, curriculum, subject matter, and methods of instruction and research. Management-level employees are not allowed to engage in collective bargaining, given that many university faculty are consulted on selection of their department head, serve on faculty senate, review graduate school applicants, and are involved in course planning. Would SB 5 make it impossible for university faculty to engage in collective bargaining? If so, what is your opinion of that result? Mr. Greenberg, 2 minutes.
It will not be impossible. Now, this is a complex issue that under this law is going to have to be resolved by the State Employee Relations Board and the courts. But I can tell you that in the private sector, this is an issue that has been discussed and debated and worked on for many, many decades under the National Labor Relations Act. The concern is that with a faculty senate system where faculty members get together to make management decisions, there could be an inherent conflict of interest if they unionize. So the issue is simply this: what is the level of decision making by the faculty senate? Or how much authority and autonomy will the faculty have in making decisions? If it's low level, they're going to be able to organize and join unions and collectively bargain, and that's fine. If it's high level, then they won't, and that's going to be resolved university by university and case by case, just as it is with private universities.
Mr. Pepper?
I think it's a great example of how this bill goes so far beyond what we're told it's supposed to be about, right? Saving money, balancing budgets. All of a sudden, we're knocking professors who decide to be on a committee to help their school out of a union. Don't we want to encourage them to take part in the direction of their school? I think it's a horrible part of the law. But it's not isolated. We're knocking sergeants out of police unions. I think it was a sergeant about three months ago in Warren County that was out putting stop sticks on the highway and got hit. You know, fire lieutenants who go to the fires, taken out of the union. Apparently they're not allowed to voice their concerns. So people might say they're management. These folks aren't sitting around a boardroom. They're out on the streets protecting us. They're trying to make their university a better place. And now we're saying to them, again, not at all related to, oh, we need to balance the budget. We can get into those issues later, by the way. It's simply taking them out of the union, saying you no longer get to be part of this, because they're actually striving, and in many cases, you know, trying to work their way through. So it's a great example. Faculty, professors, police sergeants, lieutenants in fire departments who are out there serving us are being stripped out of unions completely. It's frankly, I'm glad you asked it, it's one of the worst parts of this law. There's very little justification for it. And it again, I mean, this is so much more about ideology than anything else. You keep hearing, well, this is about balancing the budgets. There are states without collective bargaining around this country whose budgets are far worse than ours. So don't believe that one. I mean, there are other myths. If this was about salaries, which we hear about, wouldn't you expect the top leaders in Columbus to take a salary cut too, as opposed to giving themselves raises, which they've done? So when you hear this kind of issue, it should be a red flag that this is not about what you keep hearing it's about. This is a pretty ideological fight, and this is a great example of it.
30 seconds, Mr. Greenberg.
I don't think it's correct that top leaders in Columbus got raises. I think some legislative aides did. But this is a very interesting issue. You know, in the private sector under the National Labor Relations Act, since the 1930s until today, supervisors have been excluded from collective bargaining because it's an inherent conflict of interest for them to be on both sides of the bargaining table. And this is an example of how the Ohio collective bargaining reform law in 1983 went so far, much further than what we find under federal law. And this is one of the important reforms.
Thank you, Mr. Greenberg. The next question goes first to Mr. Pepper. Please explain how raises based on performance system principles would work and discuss their benefits and potential problems.
Well, it's another good question. For teachers, there's some clarity about how it might work. For everyone else, there's no explanation whatsoever. It's simply go from the old system to performance pay, no direction, no clarity. Again, this is another, but one of the things about Senate Bill 5, it was rushed through at lightning speed. They made a lot of mistakes. They admit they made a lot of mistakes. They didn't listen to input. They locked people out of the State House, but they didn't even listen to people on the management side who were telling them, fix this law, their problems. So a bunch of part-time legislators in Columbus have dictated to school boards and teachers how to do performance-based pay. Never mind that our teachers in Cincinnati public schools have actually worked for years to come up with a system that actually makes sense. Nope, Columbus decided they know better. They're going to tell every school district how to do it. And in doing so, they made huge mistakes. One of the criteria you're supposed to use in deciding performance-based pay for teachers is, are you a highly qualified teacher? It's a federal definition. Guess what? Under the law of Ohio, you have to be a teacher in Ohio. But they wrote that as a criteria because they didn't even know that. They say you have to use standardized tests. You have to use standardized tests to measure performance. Well, guess what? Only about 30% of classes have standardized tests. How do you test music and art and PE? Ask those questions. There one other part that's in there. One mandatory part is student input on the quality of that teacher. That sounds good, but I'll tell you what, the best teacher I ever had, I would not have told you in 10th grade that she was that good. She was toughest on me. She gave me a B- in grammar, but in college I knew she was the best teacher I ever had. So all of a sudden you're going to have a lot of incentives for grade inflation and a lot of new kind of teaching to make sure the students and their parents are happy with the grades they're getting. It's a great example of how this bill was rushed with all sorts of flaws in it.
Thank you, Mr. Pepper. Mr. Greenberg.
Performance-based pay is challenging. but I think that most of us would agree that one should not get raises simply for showing up every day. There needs to be a reason why a person gets a raise. They should earn it. It should be based on merit and performance, not just showing up. One of the worst aspects of the current system is that what you'll find under every union contract you look at, and they're available, and you should find them and look at it, you can find them online from the State Employee Relations Board, is the fact that just by showing up, an employee year after year can get significant raises, on top of the cost of living raises that are negotiated year after year. Here's an example. In the Cincinnati union contract with the Code Union, you've heard of the Code Union, that's the one where Diana Fry has been accused of embezzling $700,000 from the union. This is the one where the city was paying for her union time. Well, you look at that contract just for showing up. An individual called a parking supervisor who's at step 9, he's making $29.50 an hour in March of 2009. He gets 3% in 2010 up to $30.38. Another 3% in March 2010, he's up to $31.30, and then he gets bumped up to step 10 and he's at $32.23. In the midst of the worst recession that we've had since the Depression, he or she receives a $1.85 an hour raise, close to 6%, all because he showed up and quote, met expectations. That's what SB 5 reforms, and that's a necessary reform to solve our budget problems and bring merit and performance back into the system.
Mr. Pepper, 30
First,
seconds.
I'd say collective bargaining, 90% of the contracts negotiated last year had wage freezes. That was through the collective bargaining process we have. But more important, I mean, you could have a good theoretical debate about performance pay, but that's not what we have here. Again, the Cincinnati Public Schools and teachers have worked on a performance-based pay model that works. But the State House said, throw it out. We know better. Most of us know nothing about education, but we're going to give you the 5 elements you must consider in doing this. So this isn't about performance-based pay. It's about local control and the state taking over all these local decisions.
Question number 4 goes to Mr. Greenberg first. The Act requires that in negotiations the parties take into consideration the ability of the governing body to pay for any increases, and specifically states that in making the determination, the parties cannot take into account the possibility of any potential future increase in the income of the public employer that would only be possible by the employer obtaining funding from an outside source, including the passage of a levy or a bond issue. Could this impact teachers' opportunities to effectively negotiate salary increases, and if so, how? Mr. Greenberg.
I'd say the answer is no. It's going to have no impact on their ability to negotiate increases, and I consider that a very trivial part of the new law. The most important parts of this new law are the parts that restore to elected representatives, to school boards, city councils, and county commissions, the ability and the right to make the final decision on allocation of resources, and eliminates the right of public employees to disrupt essential public services through work stoppages. What you just mentioned, that part of the Act, in my view, is a non-issue.
Mr. Pepper.
I actually do agree generally, and I would, in our discussions at the collective bargaining table, think you should be held within the constraints you have and not have arbitrators making decisions on, let's say, potentially raising taxes. But let me just go, we may have a very big disagreement here. When I look big picture, the last 30 years, we got a lot more problems because of the politicians deciding to waste money than the fact that a job and family service employee makes $11 a year when she starts doing social service there. It was the politicians that passed the stadium deal. It's the politicians who give massive tax breaks to companies to move over the river and then move back 10 years later. It's the politicians who rented out jail space at rip-off costs. Those decisions have a lot more to do with the problems of our budgets than, again, the fact that, believe it or not, 10% of the county workers whose job it is to give out food stamps are themselves eligible for food stamps, and they're in unions. I don't think their salary is the problem. The problem is at the politician level, making a lot of big picture decisions, the ones that we read about every day in the paper that we all say, why couldn't we have done better? Or the fact that the firefighter makes $28,000 a year. By the way, your average firefighter makes $14 an hour. Your average part-time legislator makes $60 an hour. They refuse to lower their salaries in last budget. And by the way, it's not just the legislators who got raises and their aides. John Kasich's entire cabinet got a massive raise over what they were paid last year under Ted Strickland. So if you're trying to lead the way on raises and salaries, wouldn't you start at the top? You'd save more money, but you also would show a little leadership. So as we get into the politicians versus the employees, to me, the politicians, and we don't have to talk even about Wall Street, by the way, the politicians have caused a lot more waste than the employees working on the front lines.
Mr. Greenberg, 30 seconds.
Yeah, I don't see how Wall Street is the issue here. I also do not believe that firefighters make an average of $14 an hour. I believe it's more like twice that, but that's another story. I think you'll find if you go through the union contracts and the wages and benefits, you'll find that they are far in excess of the average wages and benefits that comparable employees in the private sector are making. Let me tell you something, that in this state, over the last 10 years, that the average person has lost wages, and in the public sector, they've gained.
Thank you,
and I will come back to that point.
Thank you, Mr. Greenberg. The next question, we start with Mr. Pepper. The Act prohibits any provisions in collective bargaining agreements that restricts class size or affects how layoffs are determined. Outline what you see as the positive or negative effects of these restrictions.
I'll get to that in 1 second. Wall Street's relevant because it's the reason why private sector wages are down. Wall Street broke our economy in 2008, and we've all been paying the price ever since. That's why it's relevant. By the way, the studies show that the average public sector worker, if you factor in education, makes 6% less in wages and benefits than the private sector. But then you got to ask yourself, what is even the equivalent of the firefighter or the police officer? How do you compare that to the private sector? I don't know. Yeah, the idea that a teacher, these folks are on the front lines. You know, let's broaden the question. You know, nurses can't bring up staffing. You know, you and I are hopefully not in the hospital every year, every month, every week. So we don't know if the staffing's strong enough there. We do know that the number of nurses you have in that hospital is one of the most important determinations of if you have a tough day, if you're going to make it through. It's a life or death thing. So I'm glad that nurses right now can bring up staffing, because I can't bring it up until too late. I'm in there saying, where's my nurse? I need help. Same thing with schools. I want a teacher to be able to meaningfully bring up the fact that 40 kids in a class is just too many for good teaching, for good education, for safety. And the idea that we would say, sorry, it's illegal. You can't bring that up anymore. Firefighters, you may think having 4 on a truck is important. You can't even talk about that. Off the table, off limits. Again, where are we going with this? These are people who are on the front lines and not only talking about themselves, but voicing concerns that affect our safety. And we're telling them, sorry, you can't bring any of that stuff anymore. It's not legal. I mean, this is one of the most preposterous parts of this law.
Mr. Greenberg?
Yes, although those subjects are no longer going to be at the bargaining table, unions and individual employees will still be able to make those issues and bring those issues forward in the public. They do have the rights of free speech after all. As far as Wall Street and the economy and the state of Ohio, here are some numbers to consider. And I'm going to take these numbers, I'm going to go back to 2007 at a time when our economy was booming. In the period from 1997 to 2007, while Texas gained 1.6 million jobs, this state lost 10,000 jobs. Okay, now there are a lot of reasons for that. But I can also tell you that one of the most important reasons for that is that this is a high-tax state. This is an expensive state in which to do business. This is a state that's not friendly to job creation. But it's also a state where in that same 10-year period, when wages in the private sector were getting lower and lower, in the public sector they were getting higher and higher because of the excessive power of our government unions. And safety, And you're going to hear a lot about safety, that the government unions are going to tell you that issue 2 is about public safety. What I want you to do is get yourself a copy of the FOP union contracts with the county sheriff and the city of Cincinnati. And there are 2 clauses I want you to look at and ask yourself whether they enhance public safety or whether they're detrimental. One clause says that after 3 years, employee discipline is wiped off the books. It's called an amnesia clause. That means that a county sheriff or a city police officer can engage in excessive force or sexual misconduct, I would say at least 9 times in a 30-year career with nothing to worry about. Doesn't have to worry about losing his job, because every time it happens, 3 years later, it's off the books. And I'll come back to the other one in a minute.
Mr. Pepper, 30 seconds.
Yeah, just a couple facts, because we keep hearing this rhetoric. Ohio is 44th out of 50 states in government spending on workers. I mentioned in the beginning, the idea that